hosted by YZ, the British Institute for Social and Economic Research, and sponsored by EMAC, the Africa Middle East Center, which is the organization that published the book that we're going to have three speakers. The first speaker, Naim Gina, who is the executive director of EMAC and the editor of the book. The second speaker is Adam Hamid, a new vice chancellor. He hasn't taken office yet, but he's vice chancellor in the making, so it's a great privilege to have him here, and he's also contributing to the book. Both of them will speak 5 to 10 minutes each, more by way of introduction, and the keynote address will be given by Joseph Dana, who is our guest for tonight. He's a journalist who is living in the US. He's living in Ramallah, which is part of the territory of the Palestinian Authority, but is also controlled from above by Israel. So the issue of the meaning of this kind of dual control may be one of the things that we raise this evening. He is one of the founders of a very important website called 972 Magazine, which is probably the best site for critical analysis of Israeli society and Palestinian-Israeli conflict, written by a group of young journalists, mostly Israelis, some Palestinians. The website is 972mag.com, so I would recommend that anyone interested in these issues will actually check it out. And we start with Naim. So just
Thanks, Ron, and I'd like to, on behalf of the African Middle East Center, also thank Wiser for organizing this event and organizing this book launch. Before I say anything about the book, and as Ron said, my job is just to introduce it to you. Before I say anything about the book itself, I just wanted to say that on the day that the book, on the first day that the book went on sale in August last year, was the day we also had the sad occasion of the passing of one of the contributors to the book. And so I'd like just to recognize and to remember him at this launch. And that is Professor Neville Alexander, who for many of us was a mentor, for some of us a very close mentor, for some of us a mentor from afar, for many of us a close friend, and an inspiration for a large number of us. I'm looking around and seeing the younger people in the audience, and perhaps not so much for the younger people, and certainly those of us that are older. And so I just thought that we should recognize Neville at the beginning of this launch. The book, Pretending Democracy, Israel and Ethnocratic States, came out actually of a conference that was organized by the African Middle East Center in 2010, and was therefore the book itself was 2 years in the making. And the objective of the conference was to have an academic engagement about the nature of the Israeli state. The theme of the conference was not what the title of the book is. The title of the book was decided after the book was put together. But it was to be an engagement, intellectual engagement about the nature of the Israeli state, what it is, what kind of structure it has, what kind of character rather than structure it has, and in terms of how it plays itself out in its politics and its policies, etc., who are its beneficiaries and who are its victims. And this is not an odd thing to say about a state. Almost all states have beneficiaries and they have victims. Certainly if you're South African, that would be difficult to understand. And so this was what the conference sought to do. By the end of the conference, we kind of reached an understanding, which is reflected, I think, in the title of the book, about the nature and character of the Israeli state. We also, in the conference attempted to unpack, in terms of that issue of beneficiaries and victims, particularly in terms of the second part, who the various layers of victims might be of that particular state. Certainly, if you speak to anyone and say who are the victims of the Israeli state, the kind of obvious and automatic response would, I guess, be Palestinians. It's a little more complicated than that. Within Israeli society, and the conference and the book do not look or did not look in the main at Palestinians outside of the Israeli state. So the Palestinians that the book looks at are Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. But they're not the only ones who are the victims of that state. And so we have a chapter, for example, about Mizrahi Jews within Israel and the kinds of discrimination that they face within that state, in a state that is not only just, as it is called, a Jewish state, but for many people it is seen as a Jewish Ashkenazi state. Today, perhaps, if we had to put that conference together, perhaps another layer that we would bring in of the victims of the Israeli state would probably be Africans, in terms of the way in which, over the past year or so, African refugees and immigrants in Israel have been treated. And not only Africans who are not Jewish, but also Africans who are Jewish. The recent story about the contraception for Ethiopians is a case in point. So states of course evolve, and so between a year ago and now, there's some evolution also in terms of who the victims of that state are. There are 18 chapters in the book, and we're very happy to say that, I'm just confirming that for myself. Yes, 18 chapters in the book. 10 of the chapters are actually contributed by South Africans, and that's for us very pleasing that even though we had an international conference and we brought people from various parts of the world, that a good number of those who can be regarded as experts in the particular areas in which they wrote are South Africans, and about 4 or 5 of those are in this room today, thankfully. And so the book, we believe, makes an important contribution to a conversation that was taking place 3 years ago, but a conversation that continues to take place and I think becomes more and more important about the nature of the Israeli state, about how the Israeli state looks in terms of other states that we might regard as similar or different, but more than that as well, about the notion of ethnocratic versus democratic states. And raises the question, which I don't think the book really answers, but raises the question of what kind of an ideal in the kind of cosmopolitan world that we live in, what kind of ideal are we actually endeavoring to achieve? Is an ethnocratic state something that we would find acceptable? In general, not just talking about Israel. In general, is that the kind of state that we would find acceptable? Whether it's a Jewish ethnocratic state in Israel or a Kurdish state for that matter in another part of the world, or Zulu state or an Afrikaner state within the borders of South Africa, is an ethnocratic state something that is acceptable? As I say, the book doesn't really answer that question. The questions that the book does attempt to answer, the question that the book attempts to answer and answers it differently in different chapters, this is what you get when you get lots of people adding their ideas together, is what kind of future would be a better future as a state for Israel. And so there are different ideas that come out of that. And concludes, and I just want to make a point about this, not only because it's the chapter that I contributed to, but concludes with the important kind of warning and consideration that in fact, whatever you might call it, however many states you think there exists in what used to be British Mandate Palestine, one authority. And within the land that is controlled by that one authority, there are people that have to live together. for a long time. And how should that come into effect? How should their living together, to use a kind of cliche term, in a harmonious way, how should that come into effect? And there's a reflection on the South African case, for example, of having gone beyond a democratic election and now, democratic processes from 1994, a situation where we have overcome, in a sense, political oppression, but where a crucial question has not been answered, and that is the question of what is the South African nation. And the implications of that are extremely serious for our nation. And our contention in that last chapter of the book is that whatever number of states there might exist on that land in future, a very important question to be answered now and to be dealt with and grappled with now is what is the nation that occupies that land? Who makes up that nation, and what is it that can hold them together as a nation? And I think that is an important question that we can go forward with from. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Naeem, and we continue with Professor Adam.
Thank you very much, thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks to Rise and Naeem. I must say this is a kind of odd way I got into this. I became an author on this project by stealth. I was never an integral part of this project. But effectively, Naeem muscled me on the day for me to pop up at the conference and be a discussant on David Blazer's paper. And so that's what I did, and he promised that there would be no more obligations except that you come and pop in, we'll give you some tea, some food, and then you disappear. And then after I disappeared a couple of months later, he began to muscle me again and insisted that I write up the discussant's comments. So I oohed and ahed, and I think it must have taken him 18 months to get that together. But eventually I did it. And that then became part of the book. And then a couple of weeks ago, he said to me, well, Liza is hosting this book, and he effectively muscled me to come and speak here. And he said, as the Vice Chancellor designate, it is outrageous that you don't come to a research center of your own university. And so I popped up here to come and speak to this. So in a lot of ways, I became an integral part of this project through a series of muscling exercises, or as they can say, persuasive exercises into this project. Encouragement. So what I'm going to say is a couple of things. I really am going to speak to what is essentially the discussive conference, rather than an academic chapter. And I'm going to make 2 or 3 points. And the first and the most substantive is that I think the most persuasive case made for trying to understand Israel-Palestine and South Africa and Northern Ireland is Darren Claeys' use of the term minority secular democracy. I think it's particularly useful, and I think it's far more nuanced than the term apartheid. And I often get into trouble with my Palestinian comrades on this. But I think that the use of the word apartheid is a political use. And I perfectly agree with it. Because what you want to do is you want to advocate for the struggle, and you want to advocate for the struggle, and what you want to do is in that process be legitimate. And there is no more appropriate term than apartheid to use. But I think that the term minority settler democracy is slightly more nuanced and contains both the similarities between the Israeli-Palestinian context and the South African context, and the dissimilarities. And the usefulness, and what Darren Claeys actually says, is that if you want to look at minority settler democracies, what is really interesting about it is there is this pretense of egalitarianism. But that in reality, it's a pretense. It's not particularly egalitarian, it's divided by inequality. And what creates this pretense is the possibility that we belong to Western civilization. That Western civilization, or the pretense that you're part of Western civilization, is the glue that defines the settler as a coherent group. And he particularly says what drives the settler, this thing is the notion of nationalism or the notion of identity in the case of Zionism. Now, I think that that's particularly useful, but I think that there is what Glaser promised to do, which he doesn't do entirely. He was going to focus on two distinct stakeholders, both the settler and the victim. And I think he does an admirable job of the settler. But I don't think he does sufficiently enough reflection on the victim. And what I want to talk about today is slightly about the victim. Who is the victim in the Palestinian? And how do you understand the victim? And why is it important to understand it? And in that I want to look at the South African. And what's striking about both the South African and Palestinian case is that the victim was defined in both universalistic terms and in particularistic terms. There were historical traditions in South Africa that defined the African in fairly narrow, particularistic, chauvinistic terms. And then there were others, traditions, historical traditions in South Africa that defined it in more universalistic terms. And the same is also true of Palestine. What is interesting is, why did the universalistic traditions dominate in the South African context? And why did more particularistic traditions tend to emerge in the Palestinian context? And I think that that's the interesting question that one wants to ask. Now, it's a particularly interesting question because if you went back 4 decades and if you asked somebody as an observer of both the South African and Palestinian, which has the more universalistic traditions? Actually, there are far more universalistic traditions in the Palestinian case than in the South African case. And the question is, what made the difference between the two? In a lot of ways, what I want to ask is why in the Palestinian case do we have a change from the universalistic traditions of the first intifada to the suicide bombings in the second intifada? And what makes that change? And for me, Glaser speaks about in part that why Israel could sell itself far better than apartheid South Africa was firstly because of the Holocaust. And the Holocaust played an important role in creating the possibilities for that in the US. The second is the role of the US. The US played a very different role in relation to the anti-apartheid movement that played the Palestinian movement. And the question I want to ask is why? Why was the US able to do that in the South African case and not in the Palestinian? And for me, I think it goes on to the notion of what universalism means in the West, and the notion of race and the notion of religion. That what is interesting about the dividing line, the perceived dividing line, the default line in the South African context, was the issue of race. And what became the perceived dividing line, the default line, in the case of Palestine and Israel, was religion. And Western civilizations, universalist conceptions, have very different approaches to both the issue of race and to the issue of religion. And that's what enables it to respond in support of the anti-apartheid movement in relation to South Africa, but to repel the Palestinian movement in relation to this. And the one example of this that I speak about in this chapter is the issue of how Western civilization relates to this thing. Why somebody like Samuel Huntington would never have argued the notion of civilization based on race, but he does argue the notion of civilization based on Christianity and religion. And it is that default contradictory approach to both religion and race that is incorporated in the notion of Western civilization and depicted in the West that manifests itself in the differential responses. You see it often in Europe, that often in Europe, at least it's what practice, and at least at the verbal level, nobody would admit to wanting a European society based on white people. Nobody would do that. But often you would have political elites in Europe saying, well, we're really concerned about Turkey joining the European Union because what it might do is compromise the Christian civilizational ethos of Western Europe. And what they often forget is Western Europe hasn't got a single Christian ethos. They've been killing each other for the last 300 or 400 years. That they're very different approaches, but that becomes the default. So it seems to me that what we want to ask is why is particularistic traditions emerge in the one, and why did universalistic traditions emerge in the other? And the answer is not in the failure or the successes of the domestic movement. It's in the failure of the international community and how it responded to the very different struggles. And it responds to the very different struggles in part because it seems to me that there's a conceptual disconnect in the notion of how it approaches the issue of race to the issue of how it approaches religion. So that's, if you like, the big substance of my chapter. I'll chat in a minute. The last thing I wanted to say that I do speak about in this thing is the notion of suicide. And that is something that one has to take into account. The by the way, suicide bombing is not a Middle Eastern phenomenon. It's emerged in different historical struggles over centuries. There are long traditions of it in Western Europe, significant traditions of it in Asia and in other parts. But it's begun to be known in the modern world as simply a manifestation, a very recent phenomenon in the Middle East. But it is, what is interesting about it is not only did it have cost for the Israeli state, which was in forms of GDP and subsequent increases, but it had a huge cost for the Palestinian movement, it seems to me. And because what it did is it undermined the international opinion on the emergence of an international solidarity movement, and it divided the liberal layer within Israel and how they approached the question. But it seems to me that you don't resolve the question of suicide bombing, whether you agree with it or not. You don't resolve it by thinking that you'll get some political elites to tell people to stop doing it. That it's a project, it's a product of the lack of hope in that society. And that the only way you can create and deal with that question is if hope is itself emerging. That does require a different approach by the international community in how it approaches and embraces the Palestinian struggle. And if we are going to look for an answer out of this quagmire, we are going to look at an answer of how do you resolve this question. It has to be understood in more universalistic understandings of how do you create a nation. And that nation has to be seen beyond race, and it has to be seen beyond religion. And one of the interesting things about the South African context, even though the Constitution itself emerges by default, what is interesting about our Constitution is it doesn't define what it is to be South African right from the outset. It defines South African in that Constitution by how we evolve. That South Africans become South African, what is South African in the 1970s and what is South African in 2020, evolves by the very nature of the interactions of its citizens. And that's something that I think is the only way we can understand, the only conceptual understanding we're going to make some success of finding a solution to the quagmire that Israel and Palestine has become.
Thank you very much. We'll go into the keynote address. I just Humphreys is making a short comment and saying that the first suicide bomber in known history is actually, but I wouldn't call him a Jew, a Hebrew. It was Samson. Destroyed the temple, killed his enemy, and killed himself in the process. And his enemy were the Philistines. So I don't know what the historical significance of this is, but it is a tradition that was back a long time, and it's widely considered to have done that in Gaza. So we have long legacy.
Historical connection.
Joseph will give the keynote address. It will be about 20-25 minutes, and we'll open for discussion after that.
Well, first, thank you for those very stimulating comments. It's really quite lovely to be in South Africa. I must note that I haven't contributed to the volume, nor did I attend the conference, and so I'm here speaking as part of a speaking tour, a lecture tour throughout South Africa. Africa, organized by the Afro-Middle East Center. And I'm coming to South Africa to talk about what I see on the ground in Israel-Palestine right now. And I think that the volume that we're discussing or launching tonight presents a very good time to kind of reflect on A, how the narrative is changing. Why is it that we're actually sitting here right now talking about these issues in such a kind of specific and sharp way? And B, what is the reaction on the ground? Because the issues that are raised in this volume, however difficult or problematic they might be, depending on your politics regarding the situation, are discussed in relatively great detail in Israeli and Palestinian society. And so what does this mean? And I want to start my comments by just kind of creating a frame of reference about what we're talking about when we talk about Israel and Palestine right now. Instead of talking about should there be a two-state solution or one-state solution, we have to remember that currently the Israeli military, the Israeli government, governs the area between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean. Inside of that area, there are effectively three forms of citizenship. One of which I have, I'm an Israeli citizen, and I acquired my citizenship by immigrating and acquired it on arrival solely based on my ethnicity, solely based on my religion. And so for someone like me, I have full democratic and civil rights, as if I did in the United States or Western Europe or South Africa. There are some hiccups about my rights being infringed upon, which we're going to talk about in a second, vis-a-vis the boycott initiative and things like that. But I do exist with recourse to law and with full democratic and civil rights. Now, the second grade of citizenship concerns the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Those Palestinians that have Israeli citizenship that live in a state of effectively institutionalized discrimination. Somewhat akin, not completely, but somewhat akin to the kind of Jim Crow legislation that we saw in the American South. And so this has to do with land rights, this has to do with purchasing land, and various other things, but it is a state of institutionalized discrimination with some civil and democratic rights. And then the third class of citizen are, of course, the Palestinians that are living in the occupied territories, which have no rights. They live under military occupation, and they have no civil or democratic rights that we can speak of. And I want to tell a small anecdote, because as was mentioned, I live in Ramallah, and I am an Israeli subject, Jewish. So I have these democratic rights. I'm in Ramallah, which is under the Palestinian Authority. It is under military occupation, of course. Israeli military jeeps coming to my neighborhood on a regular clip, just driving around or arresting people and all this kind of stuff. But it is under Palestinian Authority control according to the Oslo Accords. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is that when I'm in Ramallah living there, I'm actually a walking zone of Israeli sovereignty. Okay? So that if I was to steal something or get into a car accident, the Palestinian cop could detain me, but they would have no authority over me. They would have to hand me over to the Israelis. So Israeli law, it walks with me as I walk in the West Bank, which is kind of bizarre when you think about it. I mean, it would be like me, subscribing to American laws while in South Africa. It's a very strange kind of creation. Now, I'm talking about this just to kind of, again, ground what's going on. I think that over the last 5 years, we are starting to see a very, very profound narrative reformulation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is due to a lot of factors. Number one has been the relative cessation of Palestinian, especially suicide terrorism, in Israeli cities. And so that has created a space of status quo for many Israelis. It's a space of calm. There was a recent, well, not so recent, in 2009 there was a bombing at a Jerusalem bus station. One British citizen was killed, and Prime Minister Netanyahu greeted the nation that evening by saying, "I have presided over the big calm." We all know that things are quiet right now. And so that quietness has allowed a certain intellectual perspective to take, or a ferment to take hold in Israeli society. At the same time, the Palestinians have been attempting to albeit it's somewhat slow, but attempting to engage in similar forms of resistance that we saw during the first Intifada. So, this is kind of getting towards your question as to what happened between these two Intifadas. And there definitely is, and I see this in my, reporting and speaking with Palestinians, there is a very strong trend among Palestinians to rekindle that form of resistance to Israeli occupation. So, stone throwing as opposed to blowing up buses in Tel Aviv, boycotts, nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience, things like that. There is there's a nascent movement on the ground that is taking shape. And at the same time, we see the the explosion of social media covering these events, which is flavoring how the international community is understanding them. So when we look at one of these demonstrations that happened in, say, the West Bank village of Bilin, which is the subject of actually a Palestinian documentary, which has now been nominated by the Academy Awards for possible best documentary, which in itself is a very significant marker of how far the narrative has changed. When we see one of these demonstrations unfolding on a Friday, you can go to Reuters coverage or you can go to the Jerusalem Post or something, and you can see that kind of standard line. Palestinians rioting against Israeli security forces respond in kind of rubber bullets. Sadly, this is also in the South African news about rubber bullets lately, but you see that classic kind of framing of the conflict in terms of the peace and security narrative, which we have come to accept in Israel-Palestine. Right? This is a conflict about peace and security. This is a conflict between two relatively equal sides. The Palestinians have a government, they have a president, they have a prime minister. The Israelis have a prime minister who behaves like a king. There are these kind of markers, right? And the Israelis and the international community have spent great efforts to develop this system. And so going back to that Friday demonstration, we see that article in the Jerusalem Post that assumed, Palestinians are rioting, right? They are affecting the status quo. Therefore, they're affecting the security situation. But now we have a lot of Palestinians on the ground tweeting from these demonstrations, explaining exactly what they're doing. We're not rioting, right? This is a form of unarmed resistance. We are confronting an Israeli checkpoint that's blocking our entrance into Jerusalem, and soldiers are firing rubber bullets at us, and we're responding with rocks. Right? And so this is changing the narrative from a security-based narrative to a rights-based narrative. And when we talk about the kind of issues that are presented in the volume, about how do we create a nation, how do we think about what this area is going to look like, a rights-based narrative for both sides, for Israeli Jews, for Palestinian Arabs, for Palestinian Christians, is going to have to be forefront in our discussion and understanding of how to create an equitable nation, how to create a peaceful nation. And so I think that this is definitely fermenting on the ground. As I noted, Palestinian civil society has become very activated in this idea of rekindling the resistance of the first Intifada. Their supporters worldwide have become very, very active in the idea of perpetuating a nonviolent boycott against Israel in the form of divestment, sanctions, and boycotts. And it's challenging what we know and what we understand in the region. So I want to talk about how are the Israelis reacting to this, right? We're fortunate enough that there was just an Israeli election, and so we do have a bit of data to analyze what are the issues on Israeli minds when they go to the polls and elect the next parliament. And I'm sure if you've seen the coverage of the Israeli elections, it was very much typified by economic issues, by internal issues. Right? A lot of Israelis were, ironically, the situation in Iran was voted, or according to exit polls, was one of the least important issues for Israeli voters. And so they're going to the polls and they're talking about their own society. But how can that be? How is that possible that we're sitting here talking about whether or not Israel is an ethnocratic state, what it looks like, who are the victims, who are the perpetrators, whatnot? The region is in a state of basically chaos, right? Egypt has been replaced as a new leadership. Syria is about to fall. There's an incredible change going on in how we understand Israel-Palestine and how Israel-Palestine sits inside the region, and yet Israeli voters are going to the polls and talking about economic issues. It's very strange, right? And so I guess this is a bit of a pessimistic commentary on the situation, but I think that the status quo that has taken hold inside of Israeli society, in which the occupation feels as though, the occupied territories feel as though an extension of Israel itself, and a two-state solution is increasingly understood as empty language, has affected the ability of Israelis to kind of push forward with these very difficult questions of how to create a nation and whatnot. And one of the kind of factual instances that I will use to elaborate on this are the social justice protests that kind of took and rocked Israeli society 2 years ago. And these were really quite impressive protests. You had 500,000 Israelis in the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem at one time, which is the equivalent of what 17 million Americans in Washington, D.C., right? On the streets, angry with the government, and marching under this label of social justice for all. The nation demands social justice. And yet, the Palestinian issue was left off the table. In fact, I was doing a lot of writing basically asking them, well, how can you it's well and good that you're having a protest about, the economic issues in your country, just like they are in Spain and Greece. This is an important issue. You should be doing that, right? But you're marching under a banner of social justice for all, and you're administrating this occupation. You're controlling other people, because that is what's going on. They are controlled. I mean, we have to be honest and direct when we talk about this. And yet you see no tension there. You see no tension to bring that conversation under the umbrella of social justice. The response wasn't that great, actually, to some of those comments. And I have used that to kind of extrapolate the fact that right now, while there is a very vibrant intellectual discussion, especially in the halls of Israeli academia, as to the issues spoken about in this volume and the future of Israel-Palestine, in terms of a block of Israelis that are willing or able to really confront the system and change it, right now we don't have that. We have 500,000 people on the streets of Tel Aviv demanding social justice and saying that the occupation and the rights of Palestinians have nothing to do with it, that this is an internal Israeli issue. And that's quite sad. Now, on the flip side, when we talk about the Palestinian situation, right, what's going on in Palestine, we see Palestinian politics suffering under the weight of what has been one of the most, I would say, efficient and developed systems of colonial divide and rule in modern history. The reconciliation efforts between Hamas and Fatah are a good example of this. There's not going to be any reconciliation anytime soon. This is also one of these issues that's just going to burn and they're just going to keep kicking the can down the road. And so you see a very interesting dynamic where a lot of mainstream Palestinians, especially in the West Bank, are just growing, disconnected from the political situation, in which they don't have a strong faith in either Hamas or Fatah, if we're going to accept that those are two kind of varying ideas of how to kind of move forward. It was very interesting. I covered the statehood reaction, the UN statehood reaction, actually for the Mail and Guardian incidentally. And so when the issue went to the Security Council, there was huge demonstrations in Ramallah, massive demonstrations. People were excited. They were so, it was just euphoric. And then this year, when it actually passed in the General Assembly, it was not even half of the strength, right? Which indicates that even though the statehood initiative is a very interesting commentary on the international community also trying to kick the can down the road when it comes to the two-state solution, that Palestinians are very, very, very tired. And the suicide terrorism that you alluded to has had an incredible impact also on Palestinian society in terms of the numbers of people that have been lost as a result, as a response to this form of terrorism, and the bloodiness that fell on both sides during the Second Intifada. So, I also want to just kind of talk briefly, I know this isn't the most academic, but I'm not an academic, so I'm moonlighting here. I think that in terms of something concrete that can really shape the situation, especially for the Israelis, and that will bring these Israeli voices that we do have that are thinking about the issues presented in this volume forward, is ironically the settlement labeling that the government of South Africa looks to be passing soon. I think that this is very interesting on two levels. Number one, as a citizen, I think that government should tell me what I am purchasing and what I'm not purchasing. I don't think that the government should tell me what I should buy and what I shouldn't buy. I don't think the government's right is to tell me what I should boycott and not. But I do think that the government has a role in telling me what I should buy, or what I should, know where whatever good I'm purchasing is coming from. And so that is a very, kind of savvy move. And secondly, as I was talking about and how the Israeli conception of the occupied territories has really kind of blurred, in that the occupied territories has kind of come in to the Israeli mind in terms of how they understand where the borders of the country are, right? I think a very compelling case can be made with the Green Line, the internationally recognized Green Line that we always talk about. For many Israelis at this point, does not exist. And in practice, it really doesn't exist. In practice, the Green Line serves as a kind of demarcation between some Palestinians that have some rights and some Palestinians that have no rights. But the labeling of settlement goods by foreign countries, because the European Union, many European Union countries will follow suit. I speak with a number of diplomats on a regular basis, and the government of Ireland, Denmark, this is going to start a kind of spiraling effect, and a number of people are going to follow suit. That is a really concrete sign to Israel that it has to start to think about where its borders are, right? Because if we want to talk about boycotting a settlement product, say SodaStream, which has been the subject of a very big boycott, it is manufactured in the West Bank, and some of it is manufactured in Tel Aviv. If you want to boycott a settlement tomato,